One of the scholars whose columns I regularly read suggested that this week a pastor could admit that he or she did not know how to explain the gospel reading from Luke 16. Really, how can anyone explain what Jesus means when he says, make friends for yourself by dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal home? I mean, the next three verses at the end sound much more like Jesus. Whoever is faithful in little is faithful in much. Whoever is dishonest in little is dishonest in much. And that we are to be faithful with what belongs to another. And no one can serve two masters. You cannot serve God and wealth. So, how can it be that Jesus lifts up the dishonest manager? It's a difficult passage. And the other pastors and I in the conference, when we gathered together on Tuesday at the text study, kind of scratched our heads, and most of them chose to preach on something else. Don't tell them. But there is a point to be made here. There are passages in the Bible that really can stump even the smartest Bible scholars. We can make educated guesses, especially when a difficult passage is taken in the context of Luke, the book, and the rest of the Bible, and in the times in which it was written. There's another point for us to consider as we look at these verses from Luke 16 that I want you to remember throughout this sermon. And that is, it's difficult to talk about faith and money together. Have you noticed that it's really rare to have an honest, real-world conversation about money at church unless there is some dire need for increased offerings or a special fundraiser. One thing these challenging verses in Luke 16 show us, that even in the Bible, it's challenging to talk about money and faith together. So first let us consider the culture back when Luke was written. Rich landlords and rulers were the loan sharks of their times and charged exorbitant interest rates, even as high as 20 to 50%, and amassed more land, and that was in direct violation of what the Bible told them to do. The dishonest manager was the debt collector, and probably, as did tax collectors like Zacchaeus, collected more than his fair share. Therefore, in view of the rich man, the manager was collecting what should have gone to him. This extra interest, this extra money you're getting from my land should come to me. And so you're squandering my property. Given the practice of charging such high interest rates, when the dishonest manager cuts what is owed by 20, 50%, many of the scholars will say what he's doing is just removing the unjust interest. But even if his actions have this social justice outcome, the dishonest manager was, after all, cutting the debt for self-serving purposes. Economic systems that allow the rich to get richer and make the poor poorer are nothing new. This is what the Old Testament reading from Amos 8 was all about: trampling the needy, using dishonest measures and weights to sell produce. Selling the sweepings of wheat was to sell what the biblical law said should be left for the poor. Imagine if someone were to charge for the food in the free food pantry. Next, let's stop the cultural context and look at what else Luke says. And the verses that immediately precede what we heard today is the prodigal son, which is where the young son squanders his inheritance. Again, the dishonest manager is accused of squandering the rich man's property, using that same word. And if you look at it, I noticed this morning, the first time I read it over in Hollandale, was that not only do you hear the word squander again, but both the young son and this manager sit there in trouble and wonder to themselves, hey self, I wonder what I'm going to do. Oh yeah, I'll do this. And that's a very very strong parallel. And then the dishonest manager is forgiving debt lavishly, and he's forgiving a lot of money, a lot of things that are old, as does the father forgives the young son and lavishes him with love. So in light of the prodigal son story, the dishonest manager's action of cutting what the peasant owed is more like forgetting the debts of others, as God the Father forgives our debts. So finally, we turn to those final verses from Luke, the ones that we think sound more like Jesus. This isn't the only story in which Jesus is recorded as saying, you can't serve God and wealth. He does it on the Sermon on the Mount, too. So if we step back and look at all this, one of the conclusions we can come to is money as an item isn't evil. It's what you do with money, or more precisely, your relationship with money, that's the most important to be evil. Remember that I told you that these Bible verses today are hard, and that we have a hard time talking about money as it impacts our faith. Let's face it, many of us do not have a healthy relationship with money. Some of us have too much debt. Some of us hoard things. And our politics runs and is ruined by money. We gamble our money, not only at casinos, but if you look at it, also in the stock market. We love to save money by buying things made with cheap labor, which is exploiting others. Our money is not clean, pure, and holy. And now you know why it was more tempting to preach on 1 Timothy and prayer. But let's look again at what Jesus is telling us in Luke 16. What did the dishonest manager do? What is the key good news in the prodigal son? It's the restoration of community. The father and the son are reunited. The dishonest manager seeks to be accepted by his community. Could it be that Jesus is telling his followers to be shrewd when handling wealth that's going to be all muddied up with the reality of the broken world and sin? We are each sinner and saint, and yet we are to strive to do justice, do what's right in God's eyes. So what should we do with our money? How do we navigate our faith in a world that worships money when we need money to survive? You know you each are a manager, right? No matter how old or young you are each manager, a steward, someone who takes care of something that doesn't belong to you. Creation and all that God has blessed you. So what if you saw all that you have, including your money and your debt, all of it, as belonging to God? We are each dishonest managers. How well do you manage the gifts and talents that God has given to you? I tell you, I sure am glad that these verses come right after the story of the prodigal son. Because I really need to recall that I can run home to God, the Father in heaven, and be accepted, forgiven and loved, and then work harder at showing gratitude through good stewardship. So my prayer is that each one of you realize that no matter what, when you turn back to God and you turn to Jesus for help, God comes running to you, just like the father and the prodigal son came running to his son. Remember that you are always embraced with that love and grace. You always are given the wisdom to keep on striving to share that love with others.